1. 24 brown slaves rowed the splendid galley that would bring Prince Amgiad to the Caliph's palace, but the prince, wrapped in his purple cloak, lay alone on the deck beneath the deep blue star-spangled night sky, and his gaze... Up to this point, the little girl had been reading aloud. Now, quite suddenly, her eyes closed. Her parents looked at each other with a smile, and Fridolin bent over her, kissed her flaxen hair, and snapped shut the book that was resting on the table, which had not as yet been cleared. The child looked up as if caught out. 9 o'clock, said her father. Time for bed. And as Albertine, too, had now bent over the child, the parents' hands touched as they fondly stroked her brow, and with a tender smile that was no longer intended solely for the child, their eyes met. The maid came in and bade the little one say good night to her parents. Obediently she got up, proffered her lips to her father and mother to be kissed, and let the maid escort her quietly from the room. Left alone under the reddish glow of the hanging lamp, Fridolin and Albertine suddenly felt impelled to resume the discussion of their experiences at yesterday's masked ball, which they had begun before the evening meal. It had been their first ball of the year, which they had decided to attend just before the close of the Carnival season. Immediately upon entering the ballroom, Fridolin had been greeted like an impatiently awaited friend by 2 dominoes dressed in red, whom he had not managed to identify, even though they were remarkably well informed about various episodes from his hospital and student days. They had left the box to which they had invited him with such auspicious friendliness, promising to return shortly unmasked, but then had stayed away so long that he became impatient and decided to descend to the ground floor, hoping to meet the 2 enigmatic creatures there again. He looked around intently, without, however, catching sight of them. Instead, quite unexpectedly, another female reveler took him by the arm. It was his wife. She had just withdrawn rather abruptly from a stranger whose blasé, melancholy air and foreign-sounding, evidently Polish accent had at first intrigued her, but who had then suddenly let slip a surprisingly crude and insolent remark that had hurt and even frightened her. And so man and wife, glad at heart to have escaped a disappointingly banal charade, were soon sitting in the refreshment room over oysters and champagne, like 2 lovers among other amorous couples, and chatting amiably drew one another, as if they had just become acquainted, into a game of gallantry, seduction, resistance, and fulfillment. And then, after a swift coach ride through the white winter's night, they sank into one another's arms with an ardor they had not experienced for quite some time. A gray morning awoke them all too soon. The husband's profession summoned him to his patient's bedsides at an early hour, and the duties of housekeeper and mother did not allow Albertine to rest much longer. And so the time had passed predictably and soberly enough in work and routine chores, and the events of the previous night from first to last had faded, and only now that both their day's work was over, the child asleep and no further disturbance anticipated, did the shadowy figures from the masked ball, the melancholy stranger and the dominoes in red, revive, and those trivial encounters became magically and painfully interfused with the treacherous illusion of missed opportunities. Innocent yet ominous questions and vague ambiguous answers passed to and fro between them, and, as neither of them doubted the other's absolute candor, both felt the need for mild revenge. They exaggerated the extent to which their masked partners had attracted them, made fun of the jealous stirrings the other revealed, and lied dismissively about their own. Yet this light banter about the trivial adventures of the previous night led to more serious discussion of those hidden, scarcely admitted desires which are apt to raise dark and perilous storms even in the purest, most transparent soul, and they talked about those secret regions for which they felt hardly any longing, yet towards which the irrational winds of fate might one day drive them, if only in their dreams. For however much they might belong to one another heart and soul, they knew last night was not the first time they had been stirred by a whiff of freedom, danger, and adventure. With self-tormenting anxiety and sordid curiosity, each sought to coax admissions from the other, while drawing closer in their fear, each groped for any fact, however slight, any experience, however trivial, which might articulate the fundamentally inexpressible confession of a truth capable of releasing them from the tension and mistrust that were slowly starting to become intolerable. Whether it was because she was the more impetuous, the more honest, or the more warm-hearted, Albertine was the first to find the courage to make a frank confession, and with a trembling voice she asked Fridolin if he remembered a young man the previous summer on the Danish coast who had been sitting with two officers at the table next to them one evening, and who, on receiving a telegram during the meal, had promptly taken a hasty leave of his two friends. Fridolin nodded. "What about him?" he asked. "That same morning I'd seen him once before," replied Albertine. "As he was hurrying up the hotel stairs with his yellow suitcase, he'd glanced at me as we passed, but a few steps further up, he stopped and turned round towards me. Our eyes couldn't help meeting. He didn't smile, indeed his face seemed to cloud over, and I must have reacted likewise, because I felt moved as never before. The whole day I lay on the beach, lost in dreams. Were he to summon me, or so I believed, I wouldn't have been able to resist. I thought myself capable of doing anything. I felt I had as good as resolved to relinquish you, the child, my future. Yet at the same time, will you believe this? You were more dear to me than ever. It was that same afternoon, you remember, that we spoke so confidingly about 1,000 things, discussing our future together, talking about the child as we hadn't done for ages. And at sunset, when we were sitting on the balcony, he walked past us on the beach below without looking up, and I was overjoyed to see him. But it was you whose brow I stroked and hair I kissed, and in my love for you there was also a good deal of distressing pity. That evening I wore a white rose in my belt, and you yourself said that I looked very beautiful. Perhaps it was no coincidence that the stranger was sitting near us with his friends. He didn't look across at me, but I toyed with the idea of stepping over to his table and saying to him, "Here I am, my long-awaited one, my beloved, take me away." At that moment they brought him the telegram. He read it, went pale, whispered a few words to the younger of the two officers, and with an enigmatic look in my direction, left the room. "And then?" asked Fridolin dryly, as she fell silent. "Nothing more. All I know is that next morning I awoke feeling nervous and distressed. What I was anxious about, whether it was that he had left or that he might still be there, I don't know, and even then I didn't know. Yet when at noon he still hadn't appeared, I heaved a sigh of relief. Don't question me further, Fridolin. I've told you the whole truth. You too had some sort of experience on that beach. Of that I'm certain." Fridolin got up, paced up and down the room a few times, then said, "You're right." He stood at the window, his face in darkness. "In the morning," he began in a restrained, somewhat resentful tone, "often very early before you got up, I would wander along the shore out past the resort. Yet, early as it was, the sun would always be shining brightly over the sea. Out there, along the shore, as you know, there were little houses, each a small world unto its own, some with fenced-off gardens, some just surrounded by woods, and the bathing huts were separated from the houses by the road and by a stretch of sand. I seldom encountered anybody, and there were never any bathers at that hour. One morning, however, I suddenly became aware of a female figure, not visible before, who was gingerly advancing along the narrow gangplank of one of those bathing huts on stilts, putting one foot in front of the other and stretching her arms behind as she groped along the wooden wall. She was a young girl of no more than 15, her loose blonde hair falling over her shoulders and on one side across her tender breast. Gazing down into the water, she slowly inched her way with lowered eyes along the wall towards the near corner of the hut, and suddenly emerged directly opposite where I was standing. She reached behind her even further with her arms, as if to gain a firmer hold, looked up, and suddenly caught sight of me. Her whole body began to tremble, as though she were about to either fall or to run away. But as she could only have proceeded very slowly along the narrow plank, she decided not to move, and so she just stood there, looking at first frightened, then angry, and finally embarrassed. But all at once she smiled, a ravishing smile. Indeed, there was a welcoming twinkle in her eye, and at the same time a gentle mockery about the way she lightly skimmed the water between us with her foot. Then she stretched her young, slender body, as though exulting in her beauty, and evidently proud and sweetly aroused at feeling my ardent gaze upon her. We stood opposite each other like this for perhaps 10 seconds, with lips half open and eyes aflame. Involuntarily, I stretched out my arms towards her. There was joy and abandon in her gaze. But all at once she shook her head vigorously, let go of the side of the hut with one hand, and peremptorily signaled that I should withdraw. And when I could not bring myself to obey at once, such a pleading, such a beseeching look came into her child's eyes that I had no alternative but to turn away. I hastily resumed my walk without once turning round, not out of consideration, obedience, or chivalry, but because I'd felt so profoundly moved by her parting look, far transcending anything I'd experienced before, that I was on the point of swooning. And with that, he ended. "And how often," asked Albertine flatly, looking straight ahead, "did you later follow the same path?" "All I've told you," replied Fridolin, "just happened to occur on the last day of our stay in Denmark. Even I don't know how things might have developed under other circumstances, and you, too, Albertine, shouldn't inquire any further." He was still standing at the window, motionless. Albertine got up and went over to him, her eyes dark and moist, her brow slightly creased. "In future, we should always tell each other things like this at once," she said. He nodded silently. "Promise me." He drew her to him. "Do you really doubt that?" he asked, but his voice still sounded harsh. She took his hands, fondled them, and looked up at him with tearful eyes, in the depths of which he tried to read her thoughts. She was now thinking about the other, more real experiences of his youth, some of which she was privy to, since during the first years of their marriage he had given way to her jealous curiosity rather too eagerly, and revealed, or, as it often seemed to him, surrendered many things he should perhaps have kept to himself. He could tell that various memories were now resurfacing within her with some urgency, and so he was hardly surprised when, as if in a dream, she mentioned the half-forgotten name of one of his youthful loves. Yet to him it came across as a reproach, even as a quiet threat. He drew her hands to his lips. "In every woman, believe me, even though it may sound trite, In every woman with whom I thought I was in love, it was always you that I was searching for. I feel this more deeply, Albertine, than you can ever understand." She smiled sadly. "And what if I too had chosen to go exploring first?" she said. Her expression changed, becoming inscrutable and cold. He let go her hands as if he had caught her out in a lie or infidelity, but she continued. "Ah, if only you all knew," and again fell silent. "If we only knew, what do you mean by that?" Rather harshly, she replied. "More or less, my dear, what you imagine." "Albertine, is there something you've never told me?" She nodded with a strange smile and looked straight ahead. Vague, irrational doubts began to stir within him. "I don't quite understand," he said. "You were scarcely 17 when we became engaged." "Yes, Fridolin, a little over 16, and yet," she looked him straight in the eye, "it was not my fault if I was still a virgin when I became your wife." "Albertine," and she continued, "it was on the Wörthersee, shortly before our engagement, Fridolin, when one beautiful summer evening an extremely handsome youth appeared outside my window, which looked out over broad, extensive meadows. We chatted away together, and in the course of our conversation I thought to myself, just listen to what I thought, what a sweet, delightful young person he is. He would only have to say the word this minute, though of course it would have to be the right one, and I would go out and join him in the meadows and follow him wherever he desired, into the wood, perhaps. Or it would be lovelier still if we were to go out onto the lake together in a boat, and that night he could have everything he desired of me. Yes, that's what I thought to myself. But he didn't say the word, this charming youth. He just fondly kissed my hand, and the next morning asked me whether I would be his wife, and I said yes." Fridolin let her hand go, displeased. "And what if that evening," he remarked, "someone else had happened to stand outside your window and had said the right word? For example—" He wondered whose name he should mention, but she stretched out her arm in a gesture of protest. "Anyone else, whoever it might have been, could have said what he liked. It would have been to little avail. And if you hadn't been the one to stand before my window," she said, smiling up at him, "then the summer evening wouldn't have been so lovely either." His mouth twisted in a sneer. "That's what you say now, so at this moment you may even believe it. But—" There was a knock at the door. The chambermaid entered and announced that the porter's wife from the Schrevogogasse had come to fetch the doctor on behalf of the court councillor, who was again feeling very ill. Fridolin went into the hall, learned from the messenger that the court councillor had had another heart attack and was in a bad way, and promised to come at once. "Are you going out?" Albertine asked him as he was hastily preparing to leave, and from her irritable tone it seemed as though he were deliberately treating her unjustly. A little incredulously, Fridolin answered, "But I have to." She sighed lightly. "It shouldn't be too bad, I hope," said Fridolin. "In the past, 3 grams of morphine have usually helped him over the attack." The chambermaid brought his fur coat. Fridolin kissed Albertine on the mouth and forehead a little absent-mindedly, as if the last hour's conversation had already been erased from his memory, and hurried off. 2. Out on the street he had to unbutton his fur coat. There had been a sudden thaw, the snow on the pavements had almost completely melted, and there was a breath of the coming spring in the air. From Fridolin's apartment near the General Hospital in the Josefstadt, it was barely a quarter of an hour's walk to the Schrevogogasse, and so Fridolin soon found himself climbing the ill-lit, winding stairs of the old house to the 2nd floor and tugging at the bell. But even before the old-fashioned tinkling resounded, he noticed that the door was ajar. He stepped through the unlit hall into the living room and realized immediately that he had arrived too late. The green-shaded kerosene lamp hanging from the ceiling cast a dim light over the bed cover, under which an emaciated body was stretched out, motionless. The dead man's face was in shadow, but Fridolin knew it so well that he imagined he could see it quite distinctly. Gaunt, wrinkled, the high forehead, the full short white beard, the strikingly ugly ears with their white hairs. The court counselor's daughter, Marianne, sat at the foot of the bed, her arms hanging limply by her sides as if in utter exhaustion. There was a smell of old furniture, medicaments, kerosene, the kitchen, also a whiff of eau de cologne and rose water, and somehow Fridolin could even sense the stale, sweetish smell of this pale girl, who, though still young, had for months, for years, been losing her bloom in the course of heavy household chores, tiring care, and nocturnal vigils. When Fridolin entered, she turned to look at him, but in the meager light he had difficulty making out whether her cheeks turned red as they usually did when he appeared. She was on the point of getting up, but a gesture from Fridolin prevented her, and, nodding, she greeted him with her large, sorrowful eyes. He approached the head of the bed, mechanically felt the dead man's temples, then the wrists that protruded from the wide open sleeves resting on the bed cover, then shrugged his shoulders in a mild gesture of regret, and put his hands in the pockets of his fur coat, his gaze wandering round the room and eventually coming to rest on Marianne. Her hair was thick and fair, but dry, her neck well-formed and slender, but of a yellowish complexion and no longer completely free of wrinkles, and her lips pinched as if from many unspoken words. "Well now, my dear young lady," he said softly and almost in embarrassment, "you were scarcely unprepared for it." She stretched out her hand towards him. He took it sympathetically, asking dutifully about the last fatal attack, whereupon she related everything factually and briefly, and then described the last relatively tranquil days during which Fridolin had not seen the sick man. Fridolin drew up a chair, seating himself opposite Marianne, and to console her intimated that in his last hour her father would hardly have suffered at all. Then he asked if the relatives had been informed. Yes, the porter's wife was already on the way to her uncle, and in any case Dr. Roediger would soon be there. "My fiancé," she added, glancing at Fridolin's forehead rather than looking him in the eye. Fridolin merely nodded. In the course of a year he had met Dr. Roediger 2 or 3 times here in the house. This pale, excessively slim young man with glasses and a short blond beard, a lecturer in history at Vienna University, had made a favorable impression on him, without, however, rousing any further curiosity. Marianne would certainly look better than she did, he thought, if she were his mistress. Her hair would be less dry, her lips redder and fuller. How old would she be, he wondered. When I was first called out to the court counselors 3 or 4 years ago, she was 23. Her mother was still alive then. She was more cheerful when her mother was alive. Didn't she take singing lessons for a while? So she's going to marry this lecturer. Why is she doing it? Certainly she isn't in love with him, and he can't have much money either. What sort of marriage will it turn out to be? Well, a marriage like 1,000 others. What concern is it of mine? It's quite possible that I shall never see her again, since I will no longer have any function in this house. How many people I've never seen again who are closer to me than she is. While these thoughts were running through his head, Marianne had begun to talk about the dead man, moreover with a certain urgency, as though by virtue of the mere fact of his death he had suddenly become a person of distinction. Was he really only 54 years old? Of course, the many worries and disappointments, his wife forever ailing, and his son, too, had given him a great deal of trouble. What? She had a brother? Yes, certainly. Surely she had told the doctor about him once before. The brother was now living abroad somewhere, and hanging in Mary Ann's bedroom was a picture he had painted at 15. It showed an officer galloping down a hill. Her father had always pretended not to notice this painting, but it was a good painting. Her brother might have gone a long way under more favorable circumstances. How excitedly she talks, thought Fridolin, and how her eyes are sparkling. Fever, perhaps? Quite possibly. She's grown thinner recently, probably acute bronchitis. She talked on, but to him it seemed as if she didn't really know whom she was talking to, or as if she were talking to herself. For 12 years now her brother had been away from home. Indeed, she had still been a child when he had suddenly disappeared. It would be 4 years ago at Christmas since they had last received news of him from some small Italian town. Strange, she had forgotten its name. She continued talking thus a while, aimlessly and almost without logical connection about indifferent matters, then suddenly stopped and sat there silently, her head in her hands. Fridolin was tired and even more bored, and waited anxiously for the relatives or the fiancé to arrive. The silence in the room became oppressive. He felt as though the dead man were joining in their silence, not because he could no longer talk, but deliberately and out of sheer malice. And with a sidelong glance at him, Fridolin said, "At least, as things stand, Marian, you won't have to remain in this apartment much longer." And as she raised her head a little, yet without looking up at Fridolin, he continued, "No doubt your fiancé will soon be offered a professorship. The situation in the humanities is in that respect much more promising than with us." He reflected that years ago he too had aspired to an academic career, but that with his preference for a comfortable existence, he had in the end decided to pursue the more practical side of his profession, and suddenly he saw himself in relation to the excellent Dr. Roediger as the lesser man. "We'll be moving in the autumn," said Marian without stirring. "He's received an offer from Göttingen." "Ah," said Fridolin, and wanted to congratulate her in some way, but this hardly seemed the appropriate moment. He glanced at the closed window and, as if exercising his prerogative as a physician, opened both wings without asking her permission and let in the breeze, which, having by now become even warmer and more spring-like, seemed to bring with it a mild fragrance from the distant wakening woods. When he turned back towards the room, he saw Mary Ann's eyes turned on him questioningly. He moved closer to her and remarked, "The fresh air will do you good, I hope. It's become quite warm, and last night—" He was going to say we drove home from the masked ball in a flurry of snow, but he hastily reformulated his sentence and concluded, "Last night the snow in the streets was still 1/2 a meter deep." She hardly heard what he was saying. Her eyes grew moist, large tears rolled down her cheeks, and again she buried her face in her hands. Involuntarily he stretched out his hand and stroked her forehead. He felt her whole body tremble as she began to sob, almost inaudibly at first, then gradually louder and finally without restraint. Suddenly she slipped out of the armchair, prostrated herself at his feet, flung her arms around his knees and pressed her face against them. Then she looked up at him with wide-open, wild, agonized eyes and whispered fervently, "I don't want to leave here. Even if you never came again and I were never to see you any more, I would still want to live close by you." He was more moved than astonished, for he had always known that she was in love with him, or imagined that she was. "Please get up, Mary Ann," he said softly as he bent down and gently raised her, at the same time thinking, "There's a touch of hysteria involved here too, of course." He gave a sidelong glance at her dead father. Suppose he can hear everything, he thought. Suppose he's in a cataleptic trance. Perhaps everyone is only seemingly dead for those first few hours after passing on. He held Marian in his arms, but a little apart, and feeling a bit ridiculous, he reluctantly pressed a kiss upon her forehead. Fleetingly, he recalled a novel he had once read, in which a very young man, almost a boy, had been seduced, or rather raped, at his mother's deathbed by her best friend. In the same instant, he could not for some reason help thinking of his wife. Bitterness against her welled up inside him, and a sullen resentment of the man with the yellow suitcase on the hotel stairs in Denmark. He drew Marianne closer to him, but without feeling in the least aroused. Indeed, the sight of her lusterless dry hair and the sweetish stale smell of her unaired clothes filled him with a faint revulsion. Then the bell rang, and with a sense of being released, he hastily kissed Marianne's hand as if in gratitude, and went to open the door. Dr. Roediger was standing outside in a dark gray overcoat and galoshes, with an umbrella in his hand and an earnest expression befitting the occasion on his face. The two gentlemen nodded to one another with greater familiarity than was warranted by their actual relationship. Then they entered the room together, and Roediger, with an awkward glance at the dead man, extended his sympathies to Marianne. Fridolin went into the next room to see to the death certificate, and as he turned up the gas flame above the desk, his gaze fell on the picture of an officer in white uniform charging with saber drawn down a hill towards an unseen enemy. It was mounted in a narrow gilt frame, and the effect was no more impressive than that of a modest lithograph. Fridolin returned with the completed death certificate to the room where the bridal couple were sitting at the father's bedside, holding hands. Again the doorbell rang. Roediger got up and went to open it. Meanwhile, Marianne, her eyes on the floor, said, almost inaudibly, "I love you." Fridolin's only response was to murmur Marianne's name, not without tenderness. Roediger returned with an older married couple. It was Marianne's uncle and aunt. A few appropriate words were exchanged with the usual awkwardness that the presence of someone recently deceased tends to generate. The little room suddenly seemed to be full of mourning guests, and, feeling himself no longer needed, Fridolin paid his respects. He was conducted to the door by Roediger, who felt obliged to say a few words of thanks and to express the hope that they might meet again before too long. 3. Outside the door to the apartment block, Fridolin looked up at the window he himself had opened earlier. The frames were quivering slightly in the wind that gave a foretaste of spring. The people who had remained behind up there, the living no less than the dead, appeared equally ghostly and unreal to him. It seemed as if he had escaped, not so much from an experience as from some melancholy enchantment that must not gain power over him. The only after effect he felt was a remarkable reluctance to go home. The snow in the streets had melted. Here and there little piles of dirty white snow had accumulated. The gas flames in the street lamps flickered, and a neighboring church clock struck 11. Fridolin decided to spend another half-hour in a quiet corner of a coffee house near his apartment before going to bed, and took the route through the Rathaspark. On shadowy benches here and there, couples huddled close to one another, as if spring really had arrived, and the treacherous warm air were not pregnant with dangers. Stretched out full length on one of the benches lay a ragged-looking man, his hat pressed down over his brow. What if I were to wake him, thought Fridolin, and give him money for a night's lodging? But what good would that do? He went on to reflect. I'd then have to provide for him tomorrow, too. Otherwise there would be no point, and perhaps I would be suspected of some criminal association with him. And so he quickened his pace, as if to escape all forms of responsibility and temptation as fast as possible. Why him specifically? He asked himself. In Vienna alone there are thousands of such miserable souls. Supposing one were to start worrying about all of them, about the fates of all those unknown people. The dead man he had just left came into his mind, and with a shudder of revulsion he reflected how, in compliance with eternal laws, corruption and decay had already set to work in that emaciated body stretched out full length under the brown flannel coverlet. He was glad that he was still alive, that for him such ugly matters were still probably a long way off. Glad that he was in his prime, that a charming and lovable woman was there at his disposal, and that he could have another one, many others, if he so desired. Such things might admittedly require more courage than he could muster, and he reflected that by 8 o'clock tomorrow he would be back at the clinic, that he would have to visit his private patients from 11 to 1 and hold a seminar from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, and that in the evening, too, he would be faced with a few further house calls. Well, with luck, at least he would not be summoned in the middle of the night again, as had happened today. He crossed the Rothesplatz, which glistened faintly like a brownish pond, and turned towards home in the Josefstadt district. In the distance he could hear the regular muffled sound of marching, and still some way off, just rounding a street corner, he saw a small troop of some half-dozen fraternity students coming towards him. As the youths emerged into the light of a street lamp, he recognized that they were Alemannians from the blue colors they were sporting. He himself had never belonged to a fraternity, but he had taken part in a few fencing matches in his time, and the memory of his student days put him in mind of the dominoes in red who had enticed him into their box the night before and contemptuously abandoned him again so soon. The students were now quite close and were laughing and talking loudly. Did he know any of them from the hospital? But in the uncertain light it was impossible to make out their features clearly. He was obliged to stay very close to the wall to avoid colliding with them. Now they were past, but the last one to pass him, a lanky fellow in an open winter overcoat and with a bandage over his left eye, seemed quite deliberately to hold back a little, and, thrusting his elbow sideways, bumped against him. It could not have been an accident. "What does the fellow think he's doing?" thought Fridolin, and immediately stopped short. After a couple of steps the student did the same, and so for a moment they eyed one another at close range. But then Fridolin suddenly turned round again and continued on his way. He heard a short laugh behind him and was on the point of turning back again to challenge the fellow, but felt his heart beating wildly, exactly as it had about 12 years ago when there had been a loud knocking at his door while he had been entertaining a charming young lady given to rambling on about a probably non-existent bridegroom living some way away, though as it turned out it had only been the postman who had been knocking in so threatening a manner. And now he again felt his heart racing, exactly as on that occasion. "What's all this?" he said to himself peevishly, noticing that his knees were trembling a little. "Cowardice? Nonsense. Am I, a man of 35, a practicing physician, married and father of a child, really expected to go challenging some drunken student? Challenges, witnesses, a duel, and perhaps an arm wound into the bargain, all because of a stupid incident like that? And then be professionally incapacitated for a few weeks, or lose an eye, or even blood poisoning? Within a week he could well be as far gone as the gentleman under the brown flannel bed cover in the Schrevogelgasse. Cowardice! He had fought in 3 student fencing matches, and once had even been prepared to duel with pistols, and it certainly was not on his initiative that the matter had then been amicably settled. And what about his profession? Dangers on all sides and at every moment. It was just that one tended to forget about them. How long ago was it that that child with diphtheria had coughed in his face? No more than 3 or 4 days. Now that was a far more serious matter than some footling swordplay, and he had not thought twice about it. Well, if he met the fellow again, the matter could yet be resolved. He was scarcely obliged at midnight on the way to or from a patient, and after all that might have been the case, to respond to the absurd effrontery of some student. Now, if, on the other hand, he were to come across the young Dane with whom Albertine... No, what was he thinking of? But then, it really was no different to her having been his mistress, worse even. If only he were to come towards him now, what a pleasure it would be to stand opposite him in some forest clearing and aim the barrel of his pistol at that forehead with the fair hair combed across it. Suddenly he found himself well beyond his intended destination, in a narrow street where only a few wretched whores were strolling on their nightly manhunt. Like ghosts, he thought. And in his memory the students, too, with their blue caps, suddenly seemed ghost-like, as did Marianne with her fiancé, uncle, and aunt, whom he now imagined sitting hand in hand around the old court councilor's deathbed. Albertine, too, who floated before his mind's eye as she might appear when in deep sleep, her arms tucked beneath her neck, even his child who lay curled up in her narrow white brass bed, and the rosy-cheeked maid with the mole on her left temple. To him they had all withdrawn into the realm of ghosts, and although this made him shudder a little, there was also something soothing about this feeling, which seemed to release him from all responsibility, indeed from all connection with humanity. One of the strolling girls was on the point of propositioning him. She was a pretty creature, still quite young, but very pale, with lips painted red. This could also end in death, he thought, only not quite so quickly. Cowardice again? Basically, yes. He heard her steps, and then her voice behind him. "Won't you come with me, Doctor?" Almost against his will, he turned around. "How do you know me?" he asked. "I don't know you," she said. "But in this district, everyone's a doctor." He had not had anything to do with women of her kind since his high school days. If he were suddenly transported back to his boyhood, would this creature have attracted him? He remembered a passing acquaintance, an elegant young man who was reputed to be a great womanizer, with whom as a student he had once visited a nightclub after a ball. And how, as he departed with one of the professional hostesses, he answered Fridolin's bewildered look by saying, "It's always the most pleasurable way. Besides, they're not the worst women in the world." "What's your name?" asked Fridolin. "Mitzi, of course. What else?" She had already turned the key in the door to the apartment block, and stepping into the entrance hall, she waited for Fridolin to follow her. "Hurry up," she said as he hesitated. Suddenly he was standing next to her. The door fell to behind him, and having locked it, she lit a candle and went on ahead to light the way. "Am I mad?" he asked himself. "I won't touch her, of course." An oil lamp was burning in the room. She turned up the wick. It was quite a comfortable room, well maintained, and at least it smelled more agreeable than Marianne's quarters, for instance. Admittedly, there had not been an old man lying here sick for months. The girl smiled, and without being importunate, moved closer to Fridolin, who gently evaded her. Then she pointed to a rocking chair, which he settled into readily. "You must be very tired," she said. He nodded, and undressing without haste, she went on. "Ah, well, a man like you, with all the things you have to see to all day long, in that respect, people like us have it easier." He noticed that her lips were not made up, but were a natural red, and complimented her on them. "But why should I use makeup?" she asked. "How old do you think I am?" 20, Fridolin guessed. 17, she said, and seated herself on his lap, throwing her arm round his neck like a child. Who in the world would guess, he thought, that right now I'm here in a room like this of all places? Would I myself have believed it possible an hour or even 10 minutes ago? And what for? Whatever for? She sought his lips with hers, but he drew back, and she looked at him with large, rather sad eyes, and slipped down off his lap. He almost felt regret, as there had been a comforting tenderness in her embrace. She picked up a red dressing gown lying over the back of the bed, which was made up and ready, slipped into it, and crossed her arms over her breasts so that her figure was entirely hidden. "Is that better?" she asked without mockery, almost shyly, as if she were trying to understand him. He hardly knew what to reply. "You've guessed right," he said then. "I'm really tired, and I find it very pleasant just sitting here in the rocking chair and listening to you. You've such a sweet voice. Go on, talk to me, tell me something." She sat down on the bed and shook her head. "You're afraid?" she said quietly, and then, almost inaudibly, gazing straight ahead, "What a pity." These last words sent a warm current surging through his blood. He went over to her and attempted to embrace her, reassuring her that she inspired complete confidence in him, and indeed this was no more than the truth. He drew her to him and started to make love to her as he might to an ordinary girl or a woman that he loved. She resisted, and, feeling ashamed, he eventually desisted. Then she said, "One never knows. Sooner or later it's bound to happen. You're quite right to be afraid, and if anything were to happen, you would curse me." She refused the banknote he offered her so resolutely that he did not press her further. She wrapped a narrow blue shawl around her, lit a candle to light the way for him, and accompanied him downstairs to unlock the door. "I'm going to stay at home tonight," she said. Involuntarily, he took her hand and kissed it. She looked up at him astonished, almost frightened, then gave an embarrassed, happy laugh. "Just like a proper lady," she said. The door fell shut behind him, and Fridolin, with a quick glance, memorized the house number so that he could send wine and food up to the poor creature the following day.